Welcome to the Japan Scalers podcast. I'm your host, Tyson Batino, and on today's episode, we have Ray Sato, one of the founders at Grow, which is a rapidly growing business providing recruitment services and startup consulting. Today, we'll talk about his experiences working at UberEats and scaling their recruitment. And in the future, we would love to hear about his company Grow because it's growing so fast and it actually I think even within like 2 years meets our requirement of generating more than 100 million yen. So very impressive. And that's correct, right? Like I think was it 1 year or 2 years? I either still very impressive.
We're about a year and a half in now. Yeah, we've done a little over 3 million, or we're expecting a little over 3 million USD this year. So
Wow, that is very impressive. And so
thank
definitely
you.
meets what we let's say Japan scalers. So yeah, I'll let you give a brief introduction and we can dive in.
Cool, cool. Well, first of all, Tyson, thank you so much for having me. I guess a little bit about myself. So I'm originally from the US. I was born and raised in New York, but I've been living in Japan since 2010. And I've been recruiting for a little over a decade now. So I would say, probably one of the longer people within the industry that I've been recruiting. I guess highlight of my career is, as you mentioned, I used to work at Uber. I joined Uber back in 2018 when they had first launched in Japan. And ultimately, my task there was just to scale it as quickly as possible. Ended up building into a little over 100 people in 2 years. Yeah, and over the last few years, I've been running Grow. Basically, we've been helping startups to enter Japan, kind of hire their country managers, build out their teams locally as well. And more recently, just been trying to be a little bit more part of this startup ecosystem and see how we can develop the Japan startup system to grow.
And we'll link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. But for anyone who's interested in recruitment in Japan, either you're a recruiter yourself or you're looking for talent for your own company, Ray posts some of the most interesting content out there on recruitment in Japan with data, statistics, insights. I think it's a treasure trove of data, and I highly recommend you check it out. Before we start, here's a quick introduction to myself, your host. I'm the CEO of LaunchLab. We support setting up a company and back office in Japan. We also provide affordable advisory on raising capital, IPO, and other finance topics. I also run Scaling Your Company that provides courses and sales advisory and digital marketing agency services for the Japan market. If you need help, feel free to reach out. And yeah, so I guess we can jump in. And I think yeah, going from 10 to 120 in 2 years, it's I think that would be an interesting conversation in how culture changed because I think unless you experience it, probably it would be hard to understand or to even imagine.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the company that I joined, the company that I left and the current company are it's three or four different phases of the business, and you can really think of it as they have the same product, but the culture, the type of hires they make is very, very different. Yeah, so I guess to kind of give you a story here. So ultimately, when I joined, Uber was about 10 people, and because they had this scale up plan, it was the original plan was how do we get to 70 people across the next 12 months, but this was 70 people all hired, butts in seat is what we mentioned. So it just basically meant that we had to actually hire all of them within about 7 or 8 months. um, and really the only way to do this was to actually start by building the recruiting team to begin with, which will ultimately hire that 70 people. So it was quite interesting where I had to actually hire and interview people before even joining Uber. And it's not like I really knew what I was looking for, but I got really lucky because Uber did use a few agencies, and I happen to know all the agencies that were working with Uber. So we got lucky and basically hired four people. And on day one for Uber, when I joined, the team basically went from 10 to 14 and really just started up the scaling process from there.
Oh, gotcha. You started with gotcha. That is
Yeah, yeah,
interesting.
it was quite interesting, and it was a good team because for example, myself, I used to work at Michael Page, and there were two of us from Michael Page that Uber was actually the account that we were working The one of the guys I was working with, he used to intern at Uber Eats. He was one of the founding kind of interns at Uber Eats, so he really knew the business there. And then the two other guys we ended up hiring were kind of our competitors on a different agency, and they were the one they had made a few introductions to Uber as well. So the ramp up was nice and easy. Everybody knew the business, and everybody was kind of sold on the Uber dream at that point. So it was an interesting experience, but I would say that when we had joined, this is the typical startup, 10 people in an office, very, I wouldn't say super quiet, but, everybody was pretty focused on their own work. But, 12 months in when we were 70, 80 people, you don't even recognize you don't
Yeah.
recognize the same company that you joined it. You're in two or three more offices, you're in two or three more floors.
Gotcha.
You don't actually know everybody working there anymore, so it was quite interesting from that
Oh,
perspective.
yes, I actually am curious. It's so like for the office space, how was that transition?
Yeah, so the good thing about Uber, not all companies do this, but they had the massive growth trajectory planned. So
Gotcha.
even with 10 people, we were already in an office that could fit 100 people. So
Ah,
on the contrary, when we first got in, it was completely empty and it was like, oh, this is kind
gotcha.
of like a ghost town. But it was interesting as time goes on, you slowly see the seats starting to fill up with the people you've
Gotcha.
hired. And yeah, sooner or later, it's like now you start seeing people you don't even know who hired them just because it's gotten so big.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a game. Like you could see your level up bar, but in the real life version of just butts and seats.
Exactly. And
Uh,
and from there, I think one of the I don't want to say it's a prideful movement, but when you can move offices, that's you're doing a good job as a recruiter. The team is growing. Unfortunately, I had left before we made the office move, but I would say that's where the phase is now. When we got to 100 people, we basically maxed out our office, and they've moved into a new office in Roppongi, which fits like 500 people now, which is now it's a proper organization. So I'm sure the vibes are totally different now again.
gotcha. No, but that's really cool. You got to see let's say, the office from empty mode to full mode.
Yeah,
Cool, cool.
absolutely.
Cool. So let's kind of dive into, I'm pretty sure people know Uber Eats already, but can you tell us more about, I guess, the service of Uber Eats?
Sure. So Uber Eats is high level. It's a food delivery platform. Right, that's where it starts. As of today, I would say it's really more of a delivery platform as a whole. You can get anything delivered from point A to point B using the Uber Eats app. I would say the main focus is really going to be the large chain restaurants that you're familiar with. As a background story, probably like 20% of Uber Eats' business is actually McDonald's. So you can imagine how many people use the app for a product like that. But from there, it's really just now expanded into how do you do grocery deliveries, how do you do pharmaceutical deliveries, alcohol deliveries, and anything you can buy at a store. How do you try to get that with a touch of a button? Um, so yeah, that's kind of high level what the Uber Eats business does. It sounds a lot simpler than it really is. On the back end, it's a very very complex system where we call it a three-sided marketplace where you have the delivery partners, the actual eaters, you have the food, the restaurant, and it's a massive supply and demand model between how do you make sure that the supply and demand between these three are always in parallel. That's not my job. That's really where we have some of the smartest operations people to figure a lot of those supply and demand challenges out. But yeah, that's kind of how Uber Eats operates. And as of today, Uber Eats in Japan is actually the second biggest revenue source for Uber. So it's growing at a phenomenal rate.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
And that's why I think you mentioned 50% of your time was focused on the Japan market.
exactly. So taking a step back, my mandate as a whole was, I guess, recruiting lead for all of North Asia. North Asia included five, maybe six countries, depending on how you look at it, from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, bits of Singapore, and bits of China. And Uber has a lot of business, especially when I joined in 2018. There were about four or five different business lines from Uber Eats, which is the main one. There was the Uber Rides business. I think that's what was most popular worldwide. There was the Uber Elevate program, which is basically the flying taxis, flying drones. And then there was the Jump, basically electric micro mobility bikes and scooters and things like that. And these are the four main business lines that I was responsible for as well. But with that said, because there was such a huge emphasis on the Japan Uber Eats growth, I would say maybe 50, 60% of my time was allocated to just building the Japan Eats business up. Whereas the other maybe 40, 50% was allocated across the rest of the business lines, across the rest of the countries. So I was kind of spread out thin from that perspective.
Gotcha. And before we dive in deeper to your experience, I think it's kind of useful to ask the guests, like, what is kind of like your special sauce or your competitive advantage to survive scaling?
Mm,
And I think, let's say, it provides some context for like the story moving forward. But what would
sure,
you
sure.
say is Ray's kind of special sauce or competitive advantage to survive scaling? Because not, it's really hard for a lot of people to scale, especially when you have to reinvent yourself probably in your case, even more so, like every 3 months.
Sure, sure. I guess there's a few different ways to answer this. I think there's a few fundamental, maybe personality and skill sets, but the rest, I would say, a majority of it is really, you know, half of it is luck, half of it is just just being in the right time, the right place, and things like that. So maybe to frame the conversation, I focus mainly in the technology, recruiting in the technology space, and with a specialty more in the startups, the newer business models, companies that are just doing something a little bit differently than the rest of the legacy, Fortune 500 companies. I started recruiting back in 2014, so I have been doing this for about a decade. And number one, at this point, there just aren't that many recruiters in Japan who focus on the technology industry who are bilingual who have been doing it for 10 years. There's maybe 10 people in Japan that have been doing this. So I think that's really just where the actual edge come. Time in the game is much more important than how well you do in a short period of time, and especially in recruiting. The longer you're in recruiting, the easier the job gets. So just stay in. So I would say that's one. The second is again, being bilingual is very, very helpful in Japan. Obviously, because I work in I would say the startup bilingual space, all the clients do require English speaking. But from a candidate perspective, if it's the first 10 hires, everyone's very bilingual, so it's not really a problem. But as you scale a business, especially on the sales organization, you really start to hiring people that don't speak English. You just can't scale the team. And that's really when you have to start recruiting in Japanese. So then now you require the client side is done in English, but the candidate side is done in Japanese, and having a bilingual communication skills just helps with building that trust and things like that. The last thing, and this is something that I've definitely learned at Uber, and just I would say the most important thing about a startup, just working in a startup, is just learning to deal with change. Rather, I think you mentioned as reinventing yourself, whatever it is, it's just change is really the only constant. Something that didn't work yesterday might actually work today. Something that worked yesterday might not work today, and you just never really know because the situation is changing so rapidly. So it just keep giving things a try is
Oh,
probably the best thing. Yeah.
yeah, I really like what you said there because sometimes it is a great idea. It's just the timing was wrong.
Mm,
And
exactly, exactly.
and not having that bias that it just doesn't work. It's more like it doesn't work right now.
Exactly, exactly. And then maybe the other one is just working hard. And what I mean by hard is long hours. The one thing I really respected and enjoyed working at Uber is everybody just loves working. And they whether it's for the equity, whether it's because the product is cool, whether the team is good, everybody is always working. And what I wake up, the first thing I do is look at the phone, and the last thing I do before going to sleep is look at the phone, making sure emails are all answered and stuff like
Gotcha.
that. It is, you know, more common than I like to admit, where there's a group of guys just going out for a drink, and in the middle of a conversation, they just whip up their phone and start working. Very, very common. We're at a bar at 2 a.m. There's something that needs to be replied to the US, and you whip up the laptop at a bar and start working for 20 minutes. These were very, very common scenes that you just don't really see, that I've never seen elsewhere. But that was
Gotcha.
just, I think, the mentality that everybody had, especially at Uber, which was really enjoyable, and probably the type of mentality you would need in order to make a startup successful, especially in the early stages.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that because the Uber brand name, people knew what they're getting into.
Yeah, you think so, but then there's still some people that they just can't convert their mindset to do so. There's a in Japan, right? There's still always those people who struggle with change. I guess is maybe the best way to mention it. And even if they do work hard, they're still struggling with the change. And if you can't keep up with that, it's a very very tough job at Uber.
For fast scaling or especially blitz scaling, which is what you guys were doing. Yeah, it's you pretty much have to
Yeah, I
jump.
mean, it's you have to be prepared to make a lot of mistakes, and that's something that was quite interesting there, where it's fine to make mistakes. Nobody's really expecting perfection, but at the same time, ultimately they're just big targets. So you kind of do what you can to hit those big targets as best as possible. Many times you don't actually achieve it, but what you've gotten to is far better than putting a lower target and things like that. And that's how the scaling side actually worked. With interviews, it's really just about how do you get the hiring manager to interview as many people as possible, because there's a lot of different things that people are looking for, and that sometimes end up leading to the bad hires, the wrong hires, things like that. But even from there, it's really about how do you make the quick decisions to make sure, are they going to work out in the long term, or is it something that you ultimately have to push out in the short term? And these were some of the tougher decisions that we did have to make as well.
And one context for the audience, I think so we've had guests from like I think TripAdvisor, YouTube, very other famous companies, but I would say this might be the one blitz scaling case. Whereas the other ones I might consider more like fast scaling, but this
Mm.
would be the true blitz scaling where it's, a 100 people in pretty much.
That's fair. That's fair. Even in my last 10 years, there's really only been probably 10 companies I can think of that I would say hired at the pace that Uber did, of which now about 50% of the companies that I know blew up. They came in, they tried to hire too much, the market wasn't there, and ultimately they're probably now 20%, 30% of the size that they were originally targeting and things like that. So um, yeah, there's really only a handful there.
And you also, I think, when we were preparing, you said something really interesting about like Google's competitive advantage and like the close rate.
Yes. Um, yeah, that was a good thing about Uber, where ultimately the brand was quite good, that people wanted to join regardless of the situation. And what I mean by this is, from my experience, probably 90% of people want salary increases when they change that. They don't really want to take a salary decrease. But Uber, there was two things. One was people were interested in the brand, so they really just wanted to jump in, even if it was a salary decrease. I guess maybe the other thing was there was also the Uber did give a fair amount of equity, so there was always the upside dream that everybody was hoping for. And now take this as a grain of salt, because this was the height of the VC bubble boom, whatever you want to call it, back in 2017, 18. It was Uber, WeWork were the first tech a
Yeah.
billion dollar companies, and you thought these companies are going to $1 trillion in 5, 10 years. That was just like the entire vibe of VC. So everybody was kind of sold onto that dream. And this was when Dara was just hired, and he was
Gotcha.
trying to grow, basically 10x the business within like 3 years as well. So we were all sold on the dream. But with that said, was I mean we're all taking base salary cuts. But even with that, we still had a 95% close rate, which is just unheard of, frankly speaking. On average, I'd say close rates from an agency perspective, even from an internal perspective, usually about 60 to 70%. 75% is very, very good. Getting closing 3 out of 4 offers. But when you get to 95%, it's just unreal. And if you're always just losing to the same company, whether, maybe they just wanted to go to Google because it was a bigger brand, or they wanted to go to Netflix because Netflix has the highest salaries. And, they go to these different companies for reasons why Uber will never win. But aside from that, you go to Uber, and the other large tech companies are similar as well. Google, they probably do have a 95% close rate. Oh, I don't know about, these days, but when we're talking, 2018, 2017, when it was the company to be at. I would even be surprised if it was 99% close rates, because everybody really wanted to apply.
And they did have a somewhat of a long process too. So
Yeah.
if
Now
you
take this. I guess maybe another data point to share is what is the actual like pass through rate. So now there's a lot of random applications. So So like basically it was about 1% from people that applied to Uber to people that actually got an offer. And I guess acceptance could be, could be lower than that. So the pass rate to get in, it was actually harder than like the Ivy Leagues in the US from a
Yeah.
percentage perspective. Now, obviously, once you're in the interview, it's probably about maybe a 5 to 7% pass rate. There's a lot of failing in the initial screening of just resumes and things like that.
I gotcha.
Especially in Japan, the reality is there's a lot of people from different countries that try to apply to roles in Japan, but if you don't speak Japanese, it's kind of an automatic failure from that perspective for a lot of the positions. And kind of taking that into account, you just come to a 1% pass rate, which is pretty brutal.
I would say I may have been guilty in my previous company for what's it you using the like or including the people that we weren't gonna hire anyways. And like yes, we
Mm,
have a very strict. Yeah. And cool. So yeah, we've been talking about stage one and kind of like
mm,
stage one where you join, there's 10 people. Let's say there's no structure, you're just kind of like thrown in the deep end.
mm.
And also just kind of like some of the advantages that you had at Uber. And so I think you've touched a little bit about it, but could you kind of tell us like some of the challenges you faced in that stage one?
Yeah, absolutely. So the hardest thing is it's a mentality change. Again, to put a little bit of context here, my first job, it was at Mitsui Chemicals, very, very large, like 20, $30,000 person company. Was the most junior person joining as a new grad. I was, a tiny, tiny gear in a massive, manufacturing organization. So that was my career start. And then I fell into recruiting with Michael Page, probably one of the largest recruiting agencies in the world. But again, it was a team of 100 people in Japan where 95 people were recruiters. They were all salespeople. One of 100 was basically my main job at Michael Page. So I was always taking my kind of consider myself as someone who's relatively junior. You don't really know anything at a high level. And then you get hired. I got hired into Uber, and now I'm suddenly the only person that knows anything about recruiting. I'm the one that has to own the decisions. How do you make this, basically $1 billion company successful in Japan? And I'm taking responsibility from a hiring perspective, and I don't really know anything yet. And that was just a wild experience in terms of, you know, ultimately, I guess I have to be the one that takes ownership of this. And even though, of course, I do have a manager that I report to overseas, they don't really know much about
Yeah.
Japan. And the reality is I had 7 managers in my 2 years in Uber. So you can imagine that nobody really knows anything about Japan when you have 7 managers. Um,
Oh my
but then
goodness.
what that meant is you also have a lot of ownership. And that was where I think I learned how to make decisions, whether it was right or wrong. You just make a decision and run with it, and figure out if it was the right move over the next few weeks, few months, whatever. And that was probably the most difficult mindset change. And another example is again in Michael Page, I couldn't even get like a $200 budget to do something. It was just, is it worth it? How's about you pay for it? If it actually ends up being useful, then we'll reimburse it. And it was just a very, very conservative mindset. And you go to Uber, which is the exact opposite, right? It's a completely venture funded business. They have tons, there's no company that has more cash from that perspective. And it's just growth at all costs. So, if you think this 100K budget, or if you need to make the hires, what you need to do from a target perspective. Now just make it happen. What is the money that is necessary to make it happen? Was the thought process there. So I could make 100K USD proposal, and if you think it's going to work, you're taking ownership of it, but go ahead. And that was the type of mentality that we had. And it was really hard trying to create like $100,000 proposal when I could even get a $200 proposal, go through previously. Um, and that's not just recruiting. The reality is that's the entire organization. Every team has their high level target, and the way to get there is just totally open ended. And that's what Uber hires for. Is like
Gotcha.
this is the goal. We don't know what the route is. you're the expert. Now go do it. And
Gotcha. I mean,
we have
there's no
money in the bank account.
textbook. Yeah, it's not
Exactly,
like you're gonna go
exactly.
to the bookstore. How can I, let's say, hit
Exactly.
this target?
Yeah, like there's playbooks that that we leverage from different countries. Uber is successful in a lot of different countries, but UberEats was still relatively new at that time. It was maybe 2, 3 years in. Obviously, Japan is a very different country from the rest of the world. So operational playbooks for sure, we leveraged a lot. But then on the day to day of, I'm sure it wasn't just a recruiting perspective, even from the operational perspective, I'm sure it takes just a million years to get these Japanese companies to actually be on the platform. So there was a lot of change from that perspective.
Hello, listeners. I'm excited to announce my live cohort course to help you increase your sales in Japan. Many foreigners struggle to turn first meetings into second meetings because they lack a sales pamphlet that follows the standard format in Japan. Even if you have a good first meeting, your internal contact will hand over your current sales pamphlet to the decision maker, and they'll take one look and say they don't get Japan. My live 4-session cohort course will teach you how to make a sales pamphlet in English using the standard format in Japan. You will receive a sales pamphlet template, more than 10 examples from Japanese companies, and a lot of feedback, so you can end the course with a sales pamphlet that gets more meetings and therefore more sales. Getting one extra deal will more than pay off the course, so joining is a no-brainer. You can find more details of the course at scalingyourcompany.com/sales pamphlet. And we'll have a link in the show notes. Yes, I think that's an interesting, let's say, I think you said kind of like, in a normal company, there is the concept of a recruiting budget.
Yep.
We decided this for the next year, and this is the budget for the next year. And you need to, let's say, make do with what you have.
Exactly. Now, this also changed when I had joined. So when I had joined, it was basically just like that. There was no budget. It was growth at all costs. With growth being the key, where the cost not really being much of an issue. But then in 2018, Uber basically started preparing to go IPO, and this is obviously when everything changes. All the internal processes really start, and how do you get
Yes.
how do you make sure all the budgeting is correct? So there was a wild change just in 12 months. And by that time, Japan had scaled to a reasonable size, so it wasn't that much of an impact. But if we had this IPO strategy or IPO plan the day I had joined, like there's no way we could have hired the initial 50 to 70 people, just because, it's not even about the money. I would say it's just the process, of getting things done. I don't know if this is okay to share, but to kind of and please delete if you think it's kind of over the edge. But one of the interesting things about Uber is 95% of invoices were paid late.
Oh,
Right. And
wow.
yeah, and this isn't because of a lack of money. This isn't
Yeah.
because of, people not wanting to pay or doing anything. It was basically the outcome of everybody having their own ownership, right? So everybody's like, I need to get this job done. Let me go sign these 3 vendors to get this done. No problem. We can easily get budget, get it done. And then 3 months later, the invoice comes and goes, oh, that's just back off the admin. Let me forward the finance. And finance has no idea what it is. And it's just now the process
Yeah,
of like internal
exactly.
approvals actually begin.
I
And
figured
then
that
now,
was the issue.
yeah,
It was the accounts payable team actually trying to
exactly.
follow up with the manager, like, hey, I'm
What is
like
going
having
on
this
here? Why
fun.
do we use so much? And they're just trying to make that business case from it. And everybody's trying to do the right thing, but it's
Yeah.
the company is moving too fast that these things just don't keep up. And I was one of the bigger offenders of that as well. So I know it really well, but in the heat of the moment, if you have a target of 50 hires, I can't spend a month trying to sign this one contract all through legal and just get it done. So that was interesting.
So I'm pretty sure they probably just had to physically go to your desk, or maybe they'll send an email after a couple of days. Maybe they'll call, then maybe they'll
Yeah, and
physically
this is when you
go.
go. when you end up in like the Coupa health system where it's you have like five different people in different countries and everything, everybody's trying to come, have their conversations over Coupa, people in a different country, and they just keep closing the tickets to because they want to get their KPIs done. And I don't really mind because it doesn't really impact me. But then the vendor that we're using is the one that's not getting paid, so they're the ones stressing out is
Yeah.
all over, and they're trying to contact everybody. So it becomes quite a big of a mess.
Yeah. I can see
Yeah,
yeah, just the communication cost of
exactly.
things not
But
getting. Oh, what
I
is
also have to say that if
Coupa,
you
by the way?
Coupa is basically a internal finance tool, I guess is maybe the best way to say it. And it's the tool that the internal finance team loves because you can basically force people to all, have specific budgets for specific things. But it's the tool that every employee outside of finance hates to use because it's a nightmare to manage. And there's a lot of deep things you can do. But for example, it's like if we do an event, that it was like 70% for UberEats, but now 30% came from the rides business. And how do you split that budget between Eats and
Gotcha.
rides? And
Yeah,
this is all managed through Coupa, but Coupa is like, finance has their own way of managing things and it's just a nightmare to navigate all
gotcha.
of this. And from the
Gotcha.
recruiter side, can you just pay it? I don't really care if it's 70% Eats or rides and things like that. So that's just, yeah, that's Coupa's the internal system there from
I
finance.
I totally get it. It's I create manual versions for some clients with spreadsheets,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I did it for my other company. But yeah, okay. Now I understand the finance team's point of view there.
Yeah, but that was actually it's interesting because that was one of the big problems that I faced at Uber that I ultimately integrated into Grow, which actually helps us scale the business pretty quickly. Or I would say maybe it helps us to win business because I actually know finance is a pretty big issue, especially like recruiting managers and country managers who have to actually deal with the prop P&L. Agency recruiting, for example, is it's very bad from a finance perspective because you use percentages, right? Like 30% of a salary but we don't know what the salary is. So
Yeah,
how do we budget for that? This
yeah.
is it's a true problem for internal
Oh,
finance.
this,
Yeah. So
yeah, no, I
when
mean
I was
just
like, I,
trying to
I want to get this
forecasting
budget, and they
and
don't know.
budgets. Yeah.
Exactly. Just like, but if we use the agency for a big role, it's going to be five times more than using it for this little role, things like that. And from a recruiter, it just doesn't matter. We just
Yeah.
need the heads. But because
Oh,
of that, what I realized with the agency side now is we do a lot of flat fees because I'm tired of playing the games of like what
yeah.
is the salary and percentage. Like if we just need to get the budget, this is what we're going to charge. Just go, can you just get this budget, and we'll figure out the who you're going to hire later on. So kind of the flat fee
Gotcha.
structure, it kind of helps from a recruiting perspective.
Gotcha. Because I think as I was listening to you say, I was like, okay, I can see recruitment agencies really struggling to scale because of the cash flow.
Yes,
And
yes,
let's say,
exactly.
and a lot of, let's say, we're going to make this plan based on this one thing happening. This one thing doesn't happen. You waste all that time.
Exactly.
Gotcha. And I think, did you have any unique insights for that? I'll just call it the craziness, chaos. Right. I mean, that is the definition of VUCA. Volatile, uncertain,
Yeah,
chaotic, and I always forget what the A is, but
I don't like I don't really know what advice I have other than you should know what you're getting yourself into before you go, and it's probably going to be worse than what you think. Um,
yeah, you
but
can't
with that
imagine.
said, the worse it is, like this isn't for all companies. I'll say Uber. It was I say the word worse because it was very busy and there was a lot of long hours. But it was all worth it because like the connections you make, the people you get to work with, these are the people that the connections I kind of live off of now, and that's really all thanks to Uber. In terms of but the people that yeah, I mean, if they're just afraid of change, frankly speaking, do not go to a startup. There's just days where I mean, there's actually weeks where you just work on a problem and you think you finally have a solution, and then your manager, the director, whatever, the CEO just says pivot,
Yeah,
and you just
exactly.
wasted 3 4 weeks. And that's so normal. And I guess the other one is don't if you're a perfectionist, you're never going to succeed.
Yeah. I
Maybe
was
that's probably the best. Yeah, it's I've probably got the goal was to get things done 80% of the way and just submit it, and then get the remaining 20% if I ever receive a comment. The goal was if I had a priority list of 50 things, I'd probably only do the first five and just I'll come back to the 45 when somebody flags it or when there's an actual issue. There's a lot of undone things, and you have to be okay with that.
it's I think one thing that I think is kind of funny about myself too, like yeah, I'm very that 80% type as well. And like sometimes I'll be asked like, can you make it 100%? I was like, can you hire someone to do that for me? Like I really love doing 80%.
Yeah,
Like it just
yeah,
drives me crazy trying to go 100%. So could we
yeah. The
actually
last
hire?
20% it's a different job for sure.
Yeah, it's a different person, more that person who wants to get check all those X's and O's. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly,
But it's I'm a professional good enougher.
exactly. Yeah, good enough is uh that's the motto for sure for startups.
Yeah. So yeah,
Just get
my
it out there. No, don't be perfect.
so I'm kind of lucky for like our marketing business or at least our websites. My designer, he's the 100% type, and my full-time employee, he's more, I would say he's more than 90% type, so it's helps balance things out.
Yeah, you need a
And
little bit of everyone for sure.
I really liked how you said, yeah, I think that perfectionist angle where I think you're saying like no one gets everything done. And I think that's kind of a unique kind of like experience to share that would say change is so frequent
Yeah.
and that I guess it's not a question here, but you can probably just kind of bounce off of it. But I think the interesting how like you would think that things are being prioritized like consciously, but I think it's interesting how let's say organically things are prioritized.
Oh yes, absolutely,
If you could go a little
absolutely.
into that, I think that's kind of a unique kind of I mean just kind of like you even explaining the emotions like the feelings I think is
Yeah, I think this, this maybe this is a little more theoretical, but I think it actually starts with the OKR systems that a lot of the big tech and Uber love the OKR system. And what is that? Basically, just you create an objective or key results, usually on a 3 month rolling basis. And the key of that is it's an objective, it's not a target. So you just kind of put these numbers out there as let's try to achieve these, but they allow you to basically you have like a weekly meeting, a monthly meeting, and the objectives change just depending on the information you gather week over week. It's just like, wow, this objective just does not make any more sense, and let's just pivot, change the objective. And that was very very interesting because it just forces people to drop things that they were working on because the objective now changed. And that was a good learning. The other thing that I also realized is nobody actually knows what they're doing because you can't really tell the future, right? You make these plans, but nobody really knows if these plans are actually going to work. You think of these directors, these super senior people in these businesses know exactly how things are going to play out. They have no idea. They're basically making a plan and hoping people do the things, and it kind of goes closer to the needle to the way they want it. But the reality is everybody's just kind of pivoting on a day-to-day basis, just working with the data that they have. And everybody's panicking just as much as everybody else, even at the most senior level. So
yeah.
that was another thing that was super informative to me, that you don't have to have the answer. You just have to have like put one step next, in front of the other, and just keep doing the next most obvious thing. And sooner or later, you have a large business.
Yeah, and I think just really finding that people with that personality type, because like in my experience, like let's say having gone through that experience of scaling, communicating to people like, oh, this is just, I know it seems like I know a lot, and I actually do know a lot, but this is just a hypothesis that I'm testing.
Yes.
And I find that no matter how many times I say it, it's just something, it has to be experienced. Like meaning
Yes,
like I have to
absolutely.
change it enough time and it's like, yes, that's what I said. And it's
Yeah.
just that it's not something that can't be communicated verbally. It's just you get it or you don't get it.
Exactly, exactly. An interesting comment that so as we hire new people these days, one of my teammates was sharing to one of the new hires, what's my personality was just try stuff, just try everything, learn from it, and then try again. It is basically the I say the mindset that I have. Um, things that I think are gonna work so many times work and get the better result than what I think. And nobody really knows anything, is what I'm trying to say. So the most important thing kind of working in a startup or just in general is just try to do some taking the action to do stuff. Action provides insight and insights provide the
Yeah.
action. Yeah.
And I want to add some additional context for that for the listeners. It's because that so basically kind of like I think what Ray is describing, it's kind of the counter or like it's the medicine for the limiting belief of saying something's impossible.
Mm,
So like, if let's say initial thought is let's say you need to hire 100 people in 1 year, your initial thought is that's impossible. It can't be done. And sometimes let's say your brain just stops. And I have to explain to Japanese. It's really hard to explain to Japanese people, but I just say 思考停止ダメです. And like just have, but it's really hard to explain to Japanese people that concept of when you say something's impossible, it can't be done, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and it
mm,
doesn't happen. So I think what Ray describes is kind of the panacea to solve that problem where you're trying to do something new that has never been done before. Of course, it seems impossible because no one has done it before. And like in my case, like I think when we started the English school, my co-founder, he's like, yeah, we're gonna pay English teachers 1,200 to 1,500 yen an hour. And I'm like, there's nobody posting those salaries online. Like, how the hell am I gonna do this? Like, I'm used to paying people 2,000, like almost
sure,
double.
sure.
And my initial thought too was it's impossible, but ironically, because we didn't have money, we really focused on culture. And so
Yes.
like and let's say I was in charge of HR and then ultimately came I think 30%. I would say we got about 200 applicants a month with zero budget, just using free channels. And I think we got about 40, 50 referrals every
Wow.
month. And that was pretty much the only way we could achieve paying less than market rates because of our business model. But it also forced us, we didn't have the brand recognition, but we had to create the brand recognition of being a place that people like to work.
Yeah, that's actually a super important point that you brought up right now.
I did want to mention, so Ray mentioned about OKRs, which is objectives and key results. It's a little bit similar. I would say there's some similarities to KPIs in the sense that you do have key results, but the objective can be, let's say it's not as like with KPI, you have to have a number, but for the objective, it doesn't necessarily have to be a strict number per se. But the key results is the numbers that if you achieve these key results, you would achieve the objective. So let's say the objective is to become number one in the market or something like that.
Mm.
And you can set kind of okay, maybe we need to get 50 or we need to get like 50% of the market. How do we get 50% of the market and so on and so on.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and I think tied to that, um, one of the, it kind of comes back to the kind of action, just kind of take the next logical action comment. But what I've realized is a lot of people think whatever the problem is, whatever the target is, everybody tries to figure out how do you fix that, and you kind of figure out the next few steps. As you start doing stuff, you realize that that wasn't even a real problem, or you just kind of solve a different problem, which is like, well, let me forget about that. And that's why I always just think, don't think too much. Just what is the next logical thing that you really have to solve? And for example, with recruiting, I always have the mindset of when in doubt, just go scout, because ultimately the anything all things lead from speaking with people at recruiting. And, that is the fundamental baseline thing to get anything done. And every job should have that. This is the first thing that anything, that everybody has to be doing for there to be success. If you just kind of keep doing that one thing, it'll give you a lot of optionality later on, which will allow you to hit a success metric, regardless of whichever success metric it is.
And yeah, I kind of like that too. It's sometimes I apologize to my business friends. I'm like, sorry, I'm always selling. Like I can't help it. I'm just an entrepreneur. But
Mm.
sometimes like, you'd assume like just reach out or this one person that maybe even talked to before, like they just get it, like what you do. But actually that second time you talk to them, like, oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody remembers anything unless there's actually like they've actually used it, or it's actually super related to them. So yeah, so like always sell. I've reached out to the same people 10, 20 times, and they still don't know who I am because they don't really care when when they receive these messages. It's only when they do care and it actually impacts them is when they would remember it. And at that time, you're probably bringing value to them already. So, it just doesn't really matter.
And so I
Um,
like to use the term like,
yeah,
create the right timing
yeah, exactly.
because
That's
it's
just frequency.
yeah. Cool. Next, how would you describe pipeline acquisition or getting applicants and, the recruitment internal processes to handle? So I think maybe like 10 hires a year versus 30
Mm.
versus maybe 50 hires a year.
There's always going to be context, and it'll always be different in terms of, I guess, how large of a company you are and what kind of growth strategy you have. So I'll just give you a few different examples. So, obviously a company can be trying to hire 10 people. They can be hiring 50, 100, 200 people, whatever it is. But you also want to take into account how large the company is right now. If it's a 10% company trying to hire 50 people, it's going to look very, very different than a 100% company trying to hire, 10 people. Um, this is just because whatever the infrastructure tools, the people you have are going to be very different. And maybe even the brand awareness is going to be very, very different. Um, when you think about recruiting, there's really only a few different channels or sources that one can work with, and these are just going to be what we call outbound. This is just direct sourcing, headhunting, messages, calls, whatever it is. There's going to be the branding aspect. We call it inbound. Anything where the candidates will come to you, whether it's through websites. I guess you could kind of count referrals in here as well. And then there's going to be, even within the outbound, I guess maybe if you put in agencies in there, there's going to be local database like BizReach, on the Recruit Direct, whatever it is, but LinkedIn. But there's really only about 10 databases in Japan that candidates are active on, and the rest is what people would use, what the word networking. But the reality is networking is very, very limited. Everybody only has 100, 200 person network. So, the scouting and outbound become very, very important. Now, maybe three different examples I'll give it. If you're a relatively well-funded VC-backed startup and you're just entering Japan, looking for your first 10 hires, 0 employees, uh, frankly speaking, the hiring is going to be very, very outbound focused. They probably got an agency recruiter, an internal recruiter that goes and targets the direct competitors and tries to bring in the best possible team internally. And this is a pure headhunting approach. This really only works until about, I would say, 20 to 30 employees. And from there, the recruiting game gets much, much more difficult. And what I mean by this is, at about 30 people, depending on the business model, but you could imagine that roughly 50% are going to be a sales organization. And sales, I would say, is the job that nobody wants to do, but requires the most amount of headcount, and also has the least language skills into when I think about English and Japanese. So that's just the dynamic of sales, and that's why people make a lot of money in sales. But we'll say from like a 30-person team, you try to hire your 15th, 16th salesperson. It's going to be really, really hard to just do it through LinkedIn, just through outbound. People are going to now, there's going to be a brand piece that people are going to be looking at. First of all, are the first 10, 15 the salespeople in the business, are they successful? Is going to be one of the key metrics of what will the next person join or not. If they're not successful, nobody's going to want to join. From here, you're going to have to start opening up a lot of different channels, earlier I said you could just do a lot of inbound or a lot of headhunting and outbound sourcing, but you really need to start getting a brand out there, or even if you offer people, people aren't going to accept because there's going to be that next hot startup that is entering as well. So the competitive landscape gets a lot more aggressive. Um, but this is also where like international headquarters still want that English capability. And, a lot of companies actually struggle to scale past the 20, 30 employee mark
Gotcha.
because of the language capabilities. Um, and then I would say when you're about 50, that's where I think companies have really now accepted the realities of Japan, and you start building actually a more localized company. And this is where one companies can scale to, from 50 to about 200 or so. And then when you're about 200 people, that's just, I consider that pretty large company, especially if you're an international company in Japan
Yeah.
with 200 people. Considering it pretty large. And at that point, every channel has to be open. Whatever company you are, if you have 200 people, you've probably already contacted everybody in the market who's available online at least once. So at that point, now it's just about, they probably know the company. Now, how do you try to get them interested in the company through branding and that's called EVP, employer, value proposition, and so on.
One of the common challenges I see with my consulting clients is not having any staff internally who can drive marketing strategy and execution to the next level. This really limits the growth trajectory of a company, especially for a leader like you that wants to go from 30 million to 500 million yen a year and does not have the time to spend years learning through trial and error. To solve this problem, I'm launching a marketing agency that can help companies like yours to increase leads and closing rates through SEO, Google Maps, content marketing, and websites that convert. Head over to scalingyourcompany.com and book a free consultation. Let's talk about what your business needs are, where your current strategy is letting you down, and how we can help you see real results with the methods I've successfully implemented at multiple companies myself. Now, back to the episode. Could you explain employer value proposition? It's my first time hearing about it, but it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So EVP is basically, why would the candidate join your company? It's, the what is the value that the employer, the company, is bringing to the candidate. And this is just a very, very holistic word that, talent leaders like to use, HR leaders like to use, including everything from, compensation packages to benefits to, what's the vision and values of the company and things like that. Um, yeah, how do you brand that all externally, and there's aspects of marketing like that. There's even aspects of the business do tie into the EVP. It's not just a recruiting thing. But I would say, yeah, after about that 50 headcount mark, the EVP becomes increasingly more important because it's, you're looking for candidates from every channel. There is no channel you can just kind of skip and try to still continue to scale.
Because one topic I've had to talk to corporate leaders is uh, kind of like, I mean, they've heard about the EVP, but I
Mm,
try to bring it, when I talk to the leaders, I bring it closer to home to them. Like, why should I work for you?
mm,
Like, I can work for any other company,
exactly.
let's say, and
Exactly. Exactly.
and also kind of like talking to their leaders and saying like, you got to give those directors crap because they're not bringing top talent. And
Mm,
what's the point of having a director who doesn't have top people to lead? They're not as effective.
exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. The EVP becomes critically important because, and the hard part is, churn ties into EVP as well. So it's actually relatively easy. People in Japan, it's like they don't quit after 1 year. It still takes about 2 years for people to start really churning out. So for any hyperscale company, the first 2 years is pretty easy because there's little churn, so it's just all about growth. But then when you're at 100 person, 200 person, you have a 20% churn. Just to keep the same headcount, you have to to hire 40 people at a 200 person scale. And this is really where employee value proposition comes in as well, because obviously nobody really wants to churn out that frequently. Big tech, 4 years is pretty stable. 5 years and you're 90 percentile and so on. But with startups, 2 years is still pretty. That's where I would say the issues start happening. And losing people is probably even it's worse than not hiring because the actual knowledge base is being left as well. So that's all again all tied to the EVP and benefits and so on.
So, yeah, I've been glad to see in Japan that there's more finally there's more HRBPs or human
Mm,
resources business partner. Because I think that's been a big lack in Japan. Like you have HR generalists, but someone who really gets the business, who actually has a strategic goal and can come up with
mm,
the HR initiatives, like in training, developing, like you mentioned, kind of like retention.
yeah, yeah,
But
I
any
agree with that.
thoughts
Same
on
with
any thoughts?
recruiting as well. With It's interesting because especially in large Japanese companies, HR has a lot of power. It's just like Jinji, like people are actually afraid of Jinjibu because you never leave the company, so there's 30 years of your record, in these HR books for these large companies. But with that said, when you leave these large companies, HR really does come across as a back office admin type position. And this is, I would say, one of the biggest differences between Japanese companies versus international companies, where international companies, they everybody values it. They truly value HR and recruiting in the sense of it's its own vertical. It's not a back office function that reports to the local manager, local country manager. It has its own report line as a proper function. All the way up to the CEO. Um, and this just means you could drive proper processes, you could drive the right strategies across regions and so on, which becomes again pretty important once you try to get to a certain scale. You can't have local country managers who don't know much about recruiting trying to drive the recruiting strategy when you need to hire 50 people and things like that. So that's something that I would say has improved over the last 5, 10 years, just in companies as a whole, of just actually hiring a dedicated recruiter, a dedicated HRBP, as you mentioned, to try to solve these issues rather than just leaving it to one HR admin, HR generalist that tries to do everything.
In terms of like, the structure of a company, like 10 imp I mean, of course it depends on the company, but at least I guess for like some of the software companies you've seen, at 10 employees, what is the internal makeup? Like
Hmm.
what percentage sales at 30, 50?
Sure, makes sense, makes sense. So um, I'll generally bucket in the technology space. I generally bucket like three high level buckets is maybe the best way to put it. One is the generic enterprise software. I would say like typical SaaS business models. A lot of the AI companies might be bucketed in here. The second would be like I would say more e-commerce platform type companies, the Ubers, maybe Airbnbs. That's a platform business where it's more of a transaction. Each transaction they make like $1, but they do millions of transactions per day, so that's how they make their money. And then third is to be like a fintech, Web3 type space. And I just kind of bucket into these three categories because companies are structured very differently here in these three categories. Um, I'll just use a 20% org, as a high level thought. So when it's a SaaS business, you can imagine about 50% are going to be sales, account executives. I'm going to say 70% is going to be sales, of which 50% are like aggressive hunter sales, and 20% is like account management, customer success, supporting the existing clients. And then the remaining 30% would end up becoming, whether it's HR, finance, customer support, what things like that, more of an operational supporting structure. That's SaaS. When you think about platforms, what's different about platforms? There's usually this operations piece.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is just the platform is a lot more data driven. There's a lot more data to work with. So there's usually about 30% of the business is what you call operations, basically data analysts trying to make the best data driven decisions. And then there's going to be about maybe 20 to 30% is sales, going and acquiring new customers. But then there's also a pretty large customer support team as well, because the users are consumers in many cases. So there's just these day-to-day issues that you have to deal with. Whereas in SaaS, the users are enterprise, so you don't have as many issues. But when the issues do happen, they're a lot bigger. And then fintech is just its own category because there's so much compliance and stuff like that. So when a fintech enters, their first hire is always going to be compliance, making sure they have all the regulatory things checked off. And when they're a team of 20 or so, um, support is a massive part of fintech because there's always payment issues, there's always transaction issues, compliance issues. So I would say maybe even 30-40% of our fintech business is actually support, customer support. There's going to be two or three compliance, like maybe 10-15% is compliance and policy people. And not as many sales as you would imagine, because you just kind of need to use their platform to exist anyway. Stripe, especially as an SMB model, it's just a lot of little business will just end up using their products regardless because they have no other options. Obviously, there will be enterprise sales and things like that. So those are probably some of the differences that you'll see in terms of org charts,
Yeah,
depending on the
that's
model.
interesting about fintech. Yeah, because my experience has been that's actually a good question to ask the fintech company you're dealing with. Like, what is the ratio of support to sales? Because I've had the experience of dealing with where there's just salespeople and so there's
Yes.
no support.
Yeah. Like, I guess if it's like just maybe the first five employees, maybe you only need one support, or like maybe the support is done through Singapore or a
Yeah,
different
something like that.
country,
Yeah.
um, which has its own load of issues separately. But once you're about 20, you really need to start localizing it because a lot of the user base and that will be more local players.
And I think the third one was, I think, Web3. I think.
Yeah, Web3. Web3. It's a broad industry. There's companies that have a SaaS business model in Web3. There's the actual crypto. I guess crypto companies you can say, which are it's its own bucket. And I don't really know what the typical patterns of like a Web3 company are yet. Given I guess there's so many different models at this point.
Yes, I think we covered quite a bit. And I guess maybe I guess we could also cover maybe I guess internally, I think you kind of gave like an overview of it, of like let's say, like the office changing, let's say
Mm.
sometimes like who is this person? Like do they actually work here? And I guess kind of like your experience, like some of the I think you mentioned there was probably like four stages, three or four stages, kind of like in your mind, but
Mm.
could you describe those three or four stages?
Sure. I mean, phase one is again less than 20 employees is phase one in my opinion. This is where everybody's the biggest team is probably going to be a team of four, and everybody knows they. But even in that team of four, everybody has their own little specialty. So everybody is their own specialist, and I personally find this part the most fun. Maybe even less than 30 people. It's just where um, you have ownership. Everybody in the business. It really is like a small family that you get to work with. So that's my favorite space of of a company. Adolescence phase between that 20 to 50 mark. This tests more, I would say, global than it does test local, because I think it really is more of a global mindset change of understanding Japan in order to grow out of this phase. And again, this is where a lot of companies get stuck. And even as an agency, I judge a lot of companies here in terms of if are they willing to be flexible on requirements from this phase on. If they're not going to be a client of mine, because it's just there's just a disconnect in the realities. So I think that's a pretty important thing. And then from there, assuming they were able to make that expectation change, I would say maybe between 50 to 200 employees. That's just phase three of the next ramp up phase, you can say. Maybe that's what you can say, hyperscale, hyper growth. You already have a successful business. You're looking to 4x, 5x your business because you just see the market potential there. This part, I would say, it's become more of a proper company. So, all the proper benefits are now starting to get implemented. You have a proper HR person, the retention improvements start coming up. So you could even say like the original 20 people that joined actually start leaving at that 50 to 200 phase because it's becoming a very different company than what they've joined and what they've built. And again, this is where the challenge has, because as those 20 people leave, the people that joined because of those 20 people will also start leaving. And this is that's the second year point where I was mentioning after 2 years, we just start this growth phase, but then it's a different phase where the people join and that's where the churn starts. And again, now can you get out of that phase is you have to do the hire and
Yes.
replace and hire, I should say, in order to grow. And then after that 200, again, it's just such a massive org at that point. And you have recruiting teams that are going to be 10 people recruiting teams. Google had like a 50% recruiting team at one point, and that's just another massive business at that point. And I personally can't work in these companies because there's so many set processes already. You're becoming more
Many
of a gear and a
departments.
massive cog. Exactly, exactly. And for me, it's like going back into my first company where if you want to learn how proper processes are, should look like, then you want to be in these large companies. But once you kind of see it once or twice, I personally like being in the smaller ones where you can build those processes. But I guess highlight from a headcount perspective, that's probably the different
Yeah,
phases and some of
no,
the different challenges that you'll see.
I would say it's pretty accurate. I'll say for us at about 60 full-timers and 150 part-timers, it was,
Mm.
we did bring in a proper HR person.
Yeah,
And
sounds about right.
they brought in the systems, the compliance systems. So if we were ever to get acquired or IPO or scale or get audited, where we hit all those boxes.
Yeah,
Because I think the first thing is like, yeah, we need kind of like a time tracking system and like a time off. I'm like, why?
yeah, yeah.
Our
Up until
spreadsheet,
about yeah, until about like 30, 40 people, like one person can manage that all through spreadsheets.
yeah,
But
so
once you get to
spreadsheet,
like
yeah,
50, it's like, man, this is becoming a full-time job just managing this one
managing things,
spreadsheet.
right? And
Yeah.
like my first
60
question,
people
like,
is where they start hiring the vertical specialists, right? There's just a finance
yeah.
specialist, the accounting specialist, the HR specialist, because yeah, that's 50, 50 things. It's 50 people is a lot of people.
And we did, and that's exactly what we did. But it's funny, it's like, but my first, like, how does this make revenue?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like,
That's when the operational costs, it's bloating.
yeah,
So you need to, that's why the scale up plan to like 100 people needs to be there because you can only justify those headcounts at 100 people, but the problems started rising at 50 people. So you need to be able to have that plan.
and you mentioned something that I think kind of like the family stage, but and I think you mentioned that you really like that stage, but could you kind of go into why you like that stage?
Yeah, it's not because it seems it comes across as a family or anything like that. It's just the phase where you get to own the decisions. Usually if it's a large company, even if you're in Japan and it's 30 people, you're usually reporting to somebody overseas. So that person, you can make the assumption that that person doesn't know much about Japan. So you are the specialist of the role for that company in this country, right? There's nobody else that knows more than you. And that it's a powerful position to be in because, well, obviously the interview processes are long, so people kind of trust that you already know what you're doing, and it just means even though the country manager, 20 years more experienced than me, probably makes like 5x more money than I do, they'll still trust the judgment that I do for my specific role because they don't have the experience that I do. Um, it's just no politics. It's just really about getting the job done. Where again, once you have 50 people and you have HR, the politics do start coming into play because the health of the organization starts becoming very, very important. But less than 30, of course, the health of the organization is important, but it's like how do we not die? It's really
Yeah.
the most important thing, not how do we stay alive. Um,
I think I'll
yeah,
add some additional context too for the stages is like, and in that first 20, you do have the CEO, you have the founding team, you have that core culture. And so even if, like you may not actually be a good manager or a great leader just because people are, the vision, they're interacting with you so much, the energy, you can kind of just make it. 20 to 50, it gets a bit tougher. And like you mentioned, once that energy starts to dissipate, if they don't have something to take care of it,
mm,
that's why you get into the cycle of the original team leaving and people leaving. And at 50, you're gonna have shitty managers.
yep,
Like, that there's no question about it. It's no longer you won't have that consistency. The employee experience will be different between departments.
mm,
And so you kind of need that extra layer of maybe the benefits, and that's where the HR people can kind of help was they with or like I think you mentioned EV, like where you actually have to think about having a
yep.
employee value proposition, whereas before you just have the energy, you have the good vibes.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. And I think you mentioned managers. That's really what it is. It's just the layers. How many layers are there in the company, and how close are you to the person making the big decisions or that's owning that. You just want to be as close as you can to to the top person or the person making decisions because just more real information, less watered down BS that comes down the ropes and it's very easy to tell if I do this, it's bringing value to the company in this way. Where once you have three, four layers, you don't know if the job you're doing is for your manager or if it's just a BS job to kill your time kind of thing. And
Yeah.
that's where it becomes very very boring for me. Where it's like, I don't know, is this job even like useful? Um, and I think that's just kind of comes back down to the earlier conversation where there's 100 things to do. I like focusing on the top five, but as you get larger, when you're a 200-person organization, priority number 50 still becomes kind of important because there's such a big team. And if I'm working on priority 50, it's just not as fun as working on priority number two. So I think these are some of the changes that do happen as a company scales.
Yeah, and I think you really, as a founder, you either need really, like you're so passionate about the vision that let's say you'll push through this, let's say, or also things like I'll say things that the customers don't give a shit about. Like, let's say, because I mean, that's initially you do want to make the customers happy, but then you kind of get to the point where you have to do all these things that are like, they have nothing to do with the customer and
Mm.
just, but if your passion for that vision to make that reality is so big, or you just love the fame so much that
Yes,
you push
yeah,
through with it. Yeah, so I think there's a kind of a good conversation on stages. And also like I'm kind of the zero, let's say I'm kind of the 0 to 20 guy or I like 0 to 20 as well. And so I kind of thought like,
mm.
oh, maybe the cool company would be just, 10 people I really like working with, pay them very well, and just let's say have freelancers do the other work. But we'll have a core team of like 10 bros.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that was kind of how originally started Grow, where let's and that's what we still are, where I think about 15 full time now, and we're all very experienced, I would say, in the industry, within the startup space and so on. And it's just, when I think about the future, what's the best way to do it is like obviously just kind of keeping a small, SWAT team, 15 people, and can't complain, right? But it's also kind of gets boring. And I think that was ultimately the thing about Uber, where I don't think it's even about the money, or it's not. It's just about learning new things,
Yeah.
and especially regarding there's not much new things to do other than growing a business. So it's like, but now that I've managed 15 people, it's like, all right, now how do we get to 50 people? How do we get to 100 people with now your own organization? That's obviously going to have a whole host of different problems. But at the same time, at least you're learning, right?
That's a
So
good point. I think maybe because I'm CEO this time, maybe my thought will change. Like, no, let's grow it more.
yeah, just not to be bored is, I think, ultimately the goal after a
Yeah,
while.
I mean, I've hired a full-time employee just because I was bored, so
Yeah,
to do what
exactly,
I
right.
wanted to do. So,
Yeah, no, it's important. It's important for sure.
and so yeah, I think I guess we can just thank you for this chat. It was very entertaining, and I would like you to yeah just tell us a little bit about Grow and like who you help and maybe where people can find you and maybe who would be the ideal person to reach out to you.
Sure. So about Grow, basically we are, as I mentioned, we're a recruiting agency that helps high-level venture-backed startups from Silicon Valley to launch and scale in Japan. High level, we operate in, I guess, maybe three types of companies. Industry-wise, it's what I mentioned earlier: cloud companies, SaaS business models, platforms, fintech, and so on. But in terms of the types of companies, one would be the typical startups that I just mentioned. Uber would be one. Companies like Figma, Asana are companies we've helped launch in Japan as well. Um, One bucket. Second bucket would be, I would say, more typical. I would say typical. I would say Japanese startups that I guess are classified in the mega venture space these days. The Smart News, the Merukaris, and things like that. We do work more just like casual kind of consultation for earlier stage startups. But the reality is recruiting is not a cheap business, thing like that. So there needs to be a certain level of funding for us to partner in a traditional form. There's other forms that we do partner with. And the third would be kind of startup teams of larger organizations. So some examples can be like a Disney, but specifically Disney Plus. or Google's a client, but it would be meaning for like Gemini sales or something like that. So really
Gotcha.
focusing more on the newer, somewhat harder to understand concepts, business models is what we like to work on. Um, yeah, and I'll say these are the three main buckets that we support. Anybody that's really interested in learning about the startup space, just being a part of the startup ecosystem, whether it's on the super earlier stage, the word startup is quite loose now, where you can, even companies like Google sometimes is bucketed into startups. We don't really partner with those companies as much. We do like working with, we'll say, pre-IPO companies is the majority of our portfolio. And if you're interested in companies like that, then happy to chat and see if we can help.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, in Japan, it's, just using job boards, you only reach a really limited audience.
Mm,
So, and if you are time sensitive, you have to use recruiters if you
yes.
want quality and you're sensitive for time.
Yeah. And I'd also recommend, you have to choose the recruiter properly. So, we're not the best company to support every candidate for sure. What we're generally good at is we have a good understanding of the startup ecosystem globally. So if you're interested in this space, I think we can help. But on the contrary, there's a lot of people in Japan that want to work for, the big, big 10 tech companies. We purposely don't partner with these. I just mentioned Google, but we purposely don't partner with these companies because the way they operate is very different from the way we operate. And then even as recruiters, we need a target company to pull people from. So it depends. We try to have the larger companies as that's where our strong talent is, but the discovery phase of startups is very, very difficult. So that's what we're going to focus on, and will help a lot of these larger, people that are experienced with larger companies that want to transition into a startup or an earlier stage. That's what we prioritize.
Thank you so much, Ray.
All right.